Hello everyone, my name is Vanilma Sumsangi, a student of Mizoram University studying MBA. Today we will be discussing about secondary data collection methods in research, the introduction, definition, characteristics, advantages and disadvantages, and the difference between primary and secondary data collection. Moving on to its definition, secondary data means data that are already available, that is, they refer to the data which have already been collected and analyzed by someone else. When the researcher utilizes secondary data, then he has to look into various sources from where he can obtain them. In this case, he is certainly not confronted with the problems that are usually associated with the collection of original data. Secondary data may either be published data or unpublished data. Researcher must be very careful in using secondary data. He must make a minute scrutiny because it is just possible that the secondary data may be unsuitable or may be inadequate in the context of the problem which the researcher wants to study. In this connection, Dr. A.L. Bowley very aptly observes that it is never safe to take published statistics at their face value without knowing their meaning and limitations, and it is always necessary to criticize arguments that can be based on them. By way of caution, the researcher, before using secondary data, must see that they possess the following characteristics. Number one, we have reliability of data. The reliability can be tested by finding out such things about the said data. Who collected the data? What were the sources of data? Were they collected by using proper methods? At what time were they collected? Was there any bias of the compiler? What level of accuracy was desired? Was it achieved? Number two, suitability of data. The data that are suitable for one inquiry may not necessarily be found suitable in another inquiry. Hence, if the available data are found to be unsuitable, they should not be used by the researcher. In this context, the researcher must be very carefully scrutinize the definition of various terms and units of collection used at the time of collecting the data from the primary source originally. Similarly, the object, scope, and nature of the original inquiry must also be studied. If the researcher finds differences in these, the data will remain unsuitable for the present inquiry and should not be used. Lastly, we have adequacy of data. If the level of accuracy achieved in data is found inadequate for the purpose of the present inquiry, they will be considered as inadequate and should not be used by the researcher. The data will also be considered inadequate if they are related to an area which may be either narrower or wider than the area of the present inquiry. From all this, we can say that it is very risky to use the already available data. The already available data should be used by the researcher only when he finds them reliable, suitable, and adequate. The advantages of the secondary data refer to the benefits and importance of using the secondarily collected record and data in a research study. Some of the advantages of secondary data include time and cost effective, ease of access, longitudinal analysis, and sampling. First one, we have time and cost effective. Generally, the secondary data can be collected very easily where researchers have to find the source of that data and then collect it at all. Besides, the time and cost required to collect this type of data is very lesser as compared to that of primary data. Hence, it can be said that it is primary advantage of secondary data. This thing helps the researchers to collect the data easily and without spending much time and financial sources. Ease of access. In order to access good secondary data, the marketers visit libraries or the places where the secondary data can be found easily. Besides, internet has also made the secondary data also very much easier to access, and it can be said as another advantage of the secondary data. As an example of a research study, the literature review can be said as a secondary data which can be accessed very easily. Longitudinal analysis. Another advantage of the secondary data is that it can do longitudinal analysis where the studies are conducted spanning over a larger period of time. Usually, the secondary research data has this capability that it can be used to determine a trend. This advantage of the secondary research data can help the researchers to compare their own data with any longitudinal study which has already been conducted in that particular area of study. And next we have sampling. While using the secondary research data, the researcher can use the random sampling resulting in the larger sampling size which may not be possible in a primary data collection. Usually the organization which already have collected data use the larger samples which can be used later by other researchers for their studies. The disadvantages of the secondary data can include a number of things. Following are some of them: not specific to one's needs, biasness, lack of availability, and time lag issues. Number 1. Not specific to one's needs. In many forms of the secondary research data, it is not specific to the needs of a researcher. Therefore, the researcher cannot only rely on the secondary research data, and it is not of much use to him. It can be exemplified better by stating a simple scenario. For example, a person or organization who collected the data for itself will be saved as secondary data for future researchers. However, the future researchers who will use that data as secondary data might not find it appropriate and specific to their needs. Biasness. The secondarily collected data is usually collected by someone else than the one who uses it. Hence, generally, the secondary data is biased in the favor of one who collected it and might not necessarily meet with the requirements of another researcher. In addition, biasness can also refer to the disadvantage in terms of the researcher manipulating the secondary data. Lack of availability. This can also be said as another disadvantages where the secondary data might not be available and accessible easily. Sometimes it can be the case that researcher may not be able to find the exactly relevant and appropriate secondary available data. Sometimes a researcher conducting a study on a particular topic does not find himself in a position to find the data which addresses his research question and purpose in a proper manner. Lastly, time lag issues. Information which is collected from secondary sources such as books and historical surveys might not sync with the times and it can change drastically. Hence, this can emerge as another disadvantage of the secondary research data where the time lag issue rises, and as a result, it can be highly risky for the business or a project. Lastly, we have the difference between primary and secondary data. Primary data is the original data collected by the investigator, whereas secondary data is not original. The investigator makes use of the data collection by other investigator or agencies. Primary data collection is time-consuming and requires more energy and money, whereas use of secondary data is relatively less expensive and less time-consuming. The suitability of primary data for the current investigation will be more, since the data has been collected by the investigator. The suitability of the secondary data for the current investigator cannot be predicted. It may or may not suit the objectives of the study. Primary data will be obtained as raw data. It should be categorized before further analysis, whereas the secondary data in most of the cases will be categorized as they can be directly used in the analysis. Primary data can be used without much precaution because the data is collected by the investigator itself, whereas there The secondary data should be with greater care, otherwise it may lead to wrong interpretation. Investigations based on primary data will be more accurate since it involves the attention and personal interest of the investigator. The accuracy of the investigation with secondary data will be comparatively less since the investigator depends on the data collected by others. The source of primary data may be the result of an experiment, a survey, etc., whereas the source of secondary data are governmental and non-governmental organizations, published report, journal, books, etc. The possibility of personal prejudice exists in primary data. Possibility of lesser degree of personal prejudice. Thank you.